I'm going to talk about the microprocessor security vulnerabilities known as Spectre and Meltdown, which were first publicly reported in January 2018. We're going to focus most of my time here then on what we need to do about this, what mitigation measures we can possibly take, and I'm also going to talk about the broader implications for the computing industry. Both Spectre and Meltdown refer to design flaws in modern microprocessors that may allow one program to access the memory and hence data of another. They were identified by several researchers, including those at Google Project Zero, and are now documented on a website called meltdownattack.com. And as you can see, they now even have their own logos. Specifically, Meltdown breaks or melts the hardware isolation which is supposed to exist between user applications and the operating system. In a slightly different manner, Spectre breaks the hardware isolation that is supposed to exist between different applications. Technically, Spectre refers to two different vulnerabilities, both of which take advantage of a feature of modern processors called speculative execution. This is where a processor anticipates and performs likely future work in order to improve performance. However, the Spectre vulnerabilities trick programs into using speculative execution to leak information. In practice, what all of this means is that malware applications may be able to steal sensitive data. For example, you may enter your credit card details into a web page or your username and password into a web page, and then these may be accessed by a piece of JavaScript code hidden in a malicious online advert on another web page. Neither Spectre or Meltdown can corrupt or modify or delete data on a computer, but because they can potentially be used to access sensitive information, they are a big security risk. At the time of making this video, it's not known whether Spectre or Meltdown have been used in the real world for malicious purposes. However, it's only safe to assume that hackers will take advantage of these vulnerabilities in the future. The above all noted, viewers of this channel may be interested to learn that the ARM Cortex-A53 processors used in the Raspberry Pi 3 are not impacted by Spectre or Meltdown, a fact recently confirmed by the Raspberry Pi Foundation. Indeed, all models of Raspberry Pi ever manufactured are unaffected by Spectre and Meltdown, so if you want to use a PC which won't have these issues, you can use a Raspberry Pi. So, aside from using a Raspberry Pi, what can we all do about Spectre and Meltdown? Well, the only absolutely secure solution would be to replace every microprocessor which has the issues with a new microprocessor which doesn't have the issues. But of course, that is not a realistic possibility. A, because it would involve replacing literally billions of microprocessors, billions of computers, and secondly because Intel and AMD have not yet got on the market new chips which don't have the Meltdown and Spectre vulnerabilities. So we don't have a replacement option at the moment, and it's never really going to be a realistic, broad solution. So the only things we can do is to try and take mitigation measures to reduce the risk, and the first of these is to update your web browser. Now, fortunately, at the time of making this video, all major web browsers have been updated, so if you're running Chrome or Firefox or Internet Explorer or Edge or Safari on the Mac, just make sure that it's set to receive automatic updates. The second line of defense is operating system patches. So again, the key thing is to make sure that automatic updates are activated, as they are automatically in Windows 10, or to install manual updates on a very regular basis. And again, at the time of releasing this video, all current Microsoft, Apple, Google and Linux operating systems have been given operating system patches for Meltdown and Spectre. The third line of defense is to update the firmware or microcode that controls how the processor interfaces with the operating system and applications. And this is unfortunately where things start to get trickier, as these kinds of updates are specific to different computer hardware. So every computer user will need to obtain appropriate patches from the manufacturer of their particular computer or from their motherboard supplier. And this is not something that most users tend to be familiar with. There's also the problem that firmware updates are not yet available for less modern microprocessors, and indeed they may never become available for computers more than a few years old. At the time of making this video, Intel has released firmware patches for motherboards that support its 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th generation processors, which are also known as Haswell, Broadwell, Skylake, Kaby Lake and Coffee Lake. However, the patches for the Haswell and Broadwell chips have already been reported to cause computers to spontaneously reboot, and so I would not advise installing such patches at this time. I've now described 3 different methods which, if they're all used, should provide a reasonable level of mitigation against Spectre and Meltdown. In other words, if you patch your web browser, you patch your operating system, and you patch your firmware on your motherboard if you can, you should get a reasonable level of defense against Meltdown and Spectre. However, if you do all these things, you will also slow down your computer. There will be a performance hit. And Intel, for example, has put out some data on this. And what Intel report is that those systems which are able to be fully patched against Meltdown and Spectre will run between 2 and 11% slower. And this is also to be expected because all of these updates, all of these mitigations either require browsers or operating systems to do more work or less optimal work, or they require hardware to cease to execute speed enhancement operations. It's therefore pretty certain that 2018 will go down in history as the first year ever in which on average computers were slower at the end of the year than they were at the start of the year. This is going to be a momentous point in computing history. Even if there are no breaches of security linked to Meltdown and Spectre, there's going to be an enormous impact on the computing industry and on us as computer users, because we're all going to end up with slower computers with performance hits because of Meltdown and Spectre. Beyond the installation of software patches, we can all protect ourselves by changing our behaviour. After all, the Spectre and Meltdown flaws in our processors are only an issue if someone exploits those vulnerabilities, and we can all take measures to stop that occurring. So, for example, we can use basic good security practice. We can make sure we don't open email attachments we don't recognise or don't trust. We don't click on untrusted links in emails. We make sure we update our antivirus software, and we make sure we only visit trusted websites. Another thing we can do is to make sure we use two-factor authentication on sites where that Spectre and Meltdown are not vulnerabilities which will install malicious software on the computer. They can't change data, they simply expose data to another program. And so we can protect against that by making sure there isn't data on our computer which can be exposed to a program we don't want to see it. How do you do that? Well, it's very simple. If you don't want to have data in your computer's memory that somebody else can see, you can turn your computer off. And you can go, well, that's a bit drastic, but say you want to do online banking. If you want to do some online banking on a computer which may be insecure, which maybe you can't patch, the best thing to do is to have your computer turned off, then turn it on, go into your browser, do your online banking, close it down, turn it off again. And that way, when you then turn it on to browse to another website, that website can't get access to anything left in the memory following your online banking, like your username and passwords and details and things, because they won't be in the memory anymore. So keeping activities isolated by turning a machine on and off before you do things where you enter sensitive data is critical. For many activities, it doesn't matter that your computer has got. Since the dawn of computing, there has always been some level of trade-off between security on the one hand and ease of use and performance on the other hand. And what we're really learning now with the Meltdown and Spectre issue is that in microprocessor design for a couple of decades now, there's been too much focus on the performance side and too little on the security side. And this is something, because we've seen repeating over and over. We had the same issue with internet technology that's been developed. The web has had to increasingly be made more secure. It's certainly been an issue with Microsoft Windows that, clearly perform on the operating system. And I haven't given you more detail because to put into place the hardware patches, if they're available, that's quite a specific thing to do. It is machine specific. If you're not comfortable doing those sort of upgrades, I wouldn't do it. And I think all of us should wait a bit. I've not patched anything yet. I'm waiting to see what happens with these patches, what issues actually get thrown up. I'm relying much more on having patched at the moment browser and operating system and taking sensible steps that I describe in terms of our computing practice, our behaviour.